As the frail old man lay on his deathbed, the air in the room felt heavy. Arthur, his devoted neighbor, sat quietly by his side, unaware that the dying man was about to shatter everything he held true. With a trembling voice, the old man whispered, "Arthur, there's something I've kept hidden for decades. Ethan, your son, he's not truly yours. He's mine." The words lingered like a thunderclap, leaving Arthur stunned, his world unraveling before him. Henry Willis had always been a quiet man. In the small suburban neighborhood of Willow Creek, he was known for his stoic demeanor and solitary lifestyle. While other neighbors exchanged pleasantries over freshly mowed lawns or discussed weekend plans at the local diner, Henry kept to himself, a shadow moving silently through the neighborhood. The only person he seemed to have any real interaction with was Arthur Bennett, the man who lived next door with his wife, Margaret, and their teenage son, Ethan. Arthur and Henry couldn't have been more different. Where Arthur was gregarious and full of life, Henry was reserved and contemplative. Yet, over the years, the two had forged an unlikely friendship. It started with small favors, a helping hand with yard work, lending a tool here and there, and grew into something deeper, a bond that neither man would openly admit, but both valued. Ethan, Arthur's son, had always taken a liking to Henry. As a child, he would run over to Henry's house, eager to hear stories of Henry's younger days or to help him with small projects in his garage. Henry had a knack for woodworking, and his garage was a treasure trove of tools, half-finished carvings, and the rich, earthy scent of sawdust. Ethan, with his wide-eyed curiosity, was a constant presence in Henry's otherwise solitary world. Margaret, too, appreciated Henry's quiet kindness. Whenever Arthur was away on business trips, which were frequent given his demanding job as a sales executive, Henry would check in on Margaret and Ethan. He'd bring over freshly baked bread, fix a leaky faucet, or simply sit and talk with Margaret over a cup of tea. To the outside world, it was the picture of neighborly goodwill, but beneath the surface, it was far more complicated. Henry had secrets, dark, unspoken truths that weighed heavily on his soul. He carried them like an old, frayed coat, one he couldn't bring himself to discard no matter how much it burdened him. And as the years went by, the weight of those secrets only grew heavier. Arthur, oblivious to the complexities of the relationships around him, saw Henry as nothing more than a good neighbor and a trusted friend. He often spoke highly of Henry to others, praising his reliability and kindness. "If you need something done, Henry's your man," Arthur would say with a hearty laugh. He had no idea how true those words were in ways he could never imagine. Ethan, now a young man of 17, was the spitting image of Arthur, or so everyone said. He had Arthur's broad shoulders, his quick smile, and his easygoing nature. But there was something else, something less tangible, that set Ethan apart. It was in the way he moved, the way he spoke, the way his brow furrowed in concentration when he worked on one of Henry's woodworking projects. It was as if a piece of Henry lived within him, though no one could see it. No one, except Henry. As Ethan grew older, Henry found it increasingly difficult to hide his emotions. He watched from the sidelines as Arthur and Ethan shared moments of father-son bonding, fishing trips, football games, and weekend barbecues. Each laugh, each embrace was a knife to Henry's heart, a reminder of what he could never have. Yet he stayed silent, his love for Ethan concealed beneath layers of guilt and self-reproach. Margaret, too, carried her own burden of silence. She avoided Henry as much as she could without arousing suspicion, her guilt manifesting in small, nervous gestures, averted eyes, trembling hands, hurried conversations. She had made her choice years ago, and she stood by it, but that didn't make it any easier. The neighborhood, blissfully unaware of the emotional undercurrents swirling beneath the surface, continued its routine. Life in Willow Creek was predictable, almost idyllic. The sound of lawnmowers humming on Saturday mornings, children laughing as they played in the streets, the scent of barbecues wafting through the air. It was a slice of suburban paradise. But for Henry, Arthur, Margaret, and Ethan, it was a fragile facade, one that threatened to crumble under the weight of unspoken truths. As the years turned into decades, Henry's health began to decline. His once strong frame grew frail, his hands, once steady and skilled, now trembled with age. The man who had spent a lifetime building and creating was now facing the inevitable erosion of time. And with that erosion came a growing urgency, a desperate need to unburden himself before it was too late. Henry knew his time was running out. The secrets he had carried for so long could no longer remain hidden. They demanded to be spoken, to be acknowledged, no matter the cost. And so, as he lay in his bed, the soft hum of a nearby fan filling the silence, he made a decision. He would tell Arthur the truth, reveal the burden he had carried for decades. Little did Arthur know, the quiet man next door, the man he called his friend, was about to change his life forever. And for Henry, it was both a reckoning and a release, a final act of courage in a life defined by silence. 30 years earlier, Willow Creek was a quieter, simpler place. The houses were freshly painted, the lawns neatly trimmed, and the streets alive with the laughter of children. Among the new faces in the neighborhood was Henry Willis, a man in his late 30s, recently divorced and seeking a fresh start. Reserved and introspective, Henry contrasted sharply with the lively, family-oriented community. Despite his quiet demeanor, he radiated an air of reliability that intrigued his neighbors. Arthur Bennett and his wife, Margaret, were one of the first couples to welcome Henry. Newlyweds at the time, their marriage was already strained by Arthur's demanding career, which kept him frequently away. Margaret, vibrant and sociable, was left to navigate her loneliness while tending to their home. Her bright smiles often masked the isolation she felt, though Arthur never seemed to notice. One day, when Margaret's kitchen faucet began leaking, she turned to Henry for help. Known already as a skilled handyman, Henry fixed the problem with ease. What began as a simple favor soon grew into hours of conversation. Margaret opened up about her frustrations with Arthur's long absences, while Henry shared pieces of his own sorrow, his failed marriage and his struggle to find purpose. Their bond formed slowly, a connection neither had sought but both needed. Their meetings became more frequent. Henry helped with small repairs around the house, and Margaret invited him for coffee as a gesture of gratitude. They found comfort in each other's company, each filling a void the other had long carried. The boundary between them blurred gradually, though neither dared acknowledge it. One stormy afternoon, everything changed. Margaret asked Henry to repair a broken window latch as the rain poured outside. The atmosphere inside the house was heavy, charged with emotions they didn't fully understand. Margaret spoke of her fears and doubts about her marriage, her voice trembling. Henry, moved by her vulnerability, tried to offer comfort. In that moment, the line between friendship and something more disappeared. A single kiss turned into something neither could take back. The regret was instant. Margaret withdrew, consumed by guilt and the fear of discovery. Henry, too, was shaken, respecting her distance but burdened by what had happened. Weeks later, Margaret discovered she was pregnant. Though she and Arthur had been trying to conceive, the timing cast a shadow of doubt. The realization was crushing. There was a chance the child wasn't Arthur's. Margaret made a decision. For the sake of her marriage, her child, and herself, she would keep the secret buried. She convinced herself it was the right thing to do, though the weight of it settled heavily on her heart. When Ethan was born, Arthur was overjoyed, embracing fatherhood with a devotion Margaret couldn't fault. For Henry, Ethan's arrival was bittersweet. The boy's features held hints of Henry's own, subtle but undeniable. Yet Henry knew he could never claim him. Instead, Henry chose to be a presence in Ethan's life from a distance. He became a mentor, teaching him how to carve wood, sharing stories, and offering guidance. To Ethan, Henry was more than a neighbor. He was a trusted friend. For Henry, every moment spent with Ethan was a mix of pride and pain, a glimpse of what could never be. Margaret watched their relationship with conflicted emotions. On one hand, Henry's influence on Ethan was positive, a steadying force in the boy's life. On the other, each shared laugh and affectionate glance was a reminder of the secret she carried. She buried herself in her role as a mother, trying to atone for her mistake through devotion and sacrifice. Arthur, blissfully unaware, reveled in fatherhood. He often called Ethan his greatest achievement, words that brought pride to his heart but cut deeply into Margaret's. Henry, too, felt the sting of those words, though he stayed silent. His heart ached quietly as he realized the life he might have had. As the years passed, life in Willow Creek moved forward. Ethan grew into a curious and kind young man, his bond with Henry deepening over time. Margaret and Henry maintained their silence, though the weight of their shared secret grew heavier with each passing year. Arthur, none the wiser, continued to cherish the family he believed was his, unaware of the truth beneath the surface. But time waits for no one. By the time Ethan reached his late teens, Henry's health began to fail. His once strong hands trembled, and his energy waned. With his mortality looming, Henry felt a growing urgency to unburden himself. Margaret, sensing his resolve, grew increasingly anxious. The life they had built, a life balanced precariously on silence, was nearing its breaking point. The affair, a single moment of weakness, had cast a shadow over their lives for decades. It shaped their choices and relationships in ways none of them fully understood. Now, with Henry's time running out, the truth loomed over them all, demanding to be revealed. The fragile peace they had maintained was about to be shattered, and none of them could predict what would come next. For Henry, every moment spent with Ethan was a painful reminder of the truth he carried. Ethan, now 17, had grown into a bright and talented young man. His curiosity and kindness endeared him to everyone, and though he had Arthur's easy charm and Margaret's wit, subtler traits, his meticulousness, his quiet determination, were unmistakably Henry's. Watching Ethan mature filled Henry with pride and an aching sense of loss. Ethan often visited Henry's workshop, a cluttered space filled with sawdust and tools. Here, Henry taught him woodworking, passing down skills Ethan eagerly absorbed. Their bond was undeniable, a connection that went beyond neighborly affection. Ethan saw Henry as a mentor and father figure. For Henry, these moments were precious, fragments of the relationship he could never openly claim. Margaret watched these interactions with relief and dread. She was thankful for Henry's positive influence, but lived in fear that the truth might slip out. Over the years, she had perfected avoidance, steering conversations away from the past and burying her guilt beneath the routines of life. But as Henry's health declined, her carefully constructed facade began to crack. Arthur remained blissfully unaware. To him, Henry was a good friend, someone he trusted implicitly. He often joked that Henry was like a second father to Ethan, a comment that tightened Margaret's chest every time. She would force a smile, praying Arthur would never uncover the truth lurking beneath their idyllic life. One evening, as the sun cast a warm glow over Willow Creek, Ethan brought Henry a wooden box he'd crafted. "I wanted to show you this," he said, his voice full of excitement. "I think it's my best work yet." Henry ran his trembling fingers over the intricate carvings. "You've done well, Ethan," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've got a real talent." Ethan's face lit up. "It's all thanks to you. You've taught me everything I know." Henry's heart ached at the words, the weight of his secret pressing down on him. He wanted to tell Ethan the truth, to explain their bond, but fear held him back. How could he risk shattering Ethan's world and destroying the family he loved? Yet, as his time grew shorter, the urgency to unburden himself intensified. That night, Henry lay awake, haunted by decades of silence. He had convinced himself that keeping the truth hidden was best for everyone, But now he questioned that decision. Did Ethan deserve to know? Would the truth bring healing or devastation? Margaret, too, couldn't sleep. She had noticed Henry's lingering glances at Ethan and the heaviness in his demeanor. She knew the secret they shared was becoming unbearable for him. The thought terrified her. She had spent years building a life around the lie, telling herself it was for the best. But deep down, she knew the truth had a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply it was buried. The next morning, Henry invited Arthur over under the pretense of needing help with a project. As they worked side by side, Henry searched for the courage to speak. But every time he opened his mouth, the words caught in his throat. Arthur, oblivious to Henry's inner turmoil, chatted about Ethan's future. "He's got big dreams. Architecture school, internships. I couldn't be prouder of him," Arthur said, his pride evident. Henry nodded, his chest tightening. "He's a good kid," he said softly. After Arthur left, Henry felt a pang of regret. He had missed another chance to confess, held back by fear of the consequences. Anger, betrayal, heartbreak. He resolved to try again, though he knew time was running out. That evening, Margaret visited Henry. She had sensed his growing unease and needed to address it. "Henry," she began, her voice trembling, "I know you're struggling, but please, for all our sakes, don't do anything rash." Henry met her gaze, his eyes filled with sorrow. "Margaret, I don't think I can carry this much longer," he said. "Ethan deserves to know." Margaret's breath caught. "And what about Arthur?" she asked, her voice rising. "What about the life we've built? Do you really want to destroy everything?" Henry hesitated. "I don't want to hurt anyone," he said, "but I can't leave this world without telling him the truth. He has a right to know." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. She knew Henry was right, but the thought of their carefully constructed lives unraveling was too much. "Please," she whispered, "just give me more time." Henry nodded reluctantly, though he knew his time was limited. As Margaret left, a sense of foreboding settled over him. The truth, once buried, was clawing its way to the surface. The question was not if it would come out, but when, and how much it would cost. The next day, Henry watched from his window as Ethan played basketball in the driveway. He wanted to savor this moment, to remember Ethan as he was, young, hopeful, unburdened by the shadows of the past. But the shadows were creeping closer, and Henry knew he couldn't keep them at bay much longer. The weight of Henry's secret had never felt heavier. Days turned into weeks, and with each passing moment, the urgency to unburden himself grew. His health was failing, and he knew his time was running out. Despite his fear of the fallout, Henry resolved to tell Ethan the truth before it was too late. One crisp autumn afternoon, Ethan arrived at Henry's house carrying a bag of tools. "Thought I'd help you finish that bookshelf," he said, rolling up his sleeves. Henry nodded, his heart heavy. He watched Ethan work, his movements deliberate and precise, and felt an overwhelming mix of pride and sorrow. This was his son, a truth he had never been able to say out loud. As they worked side by side, Henry's mind raced. How could he begin to explain? What words could convey his regret, his reasons for silence, and the love he had carried for Ethan all these years? The air between them was thick with unspoken words, and Henry felt the weight of every moment slipping away. "Ethan," he said finally, his voice trembling. Ethan paused, looking up from his work. "There's something I need to tell you. Something important." Ethan frowned, concern flickering in his eyes. "What is it, Henry? Are you okay?" Henry hesitated, his hands shaking. The words were on the tip of his tongue, but the fear of destroying Ethan's world held him back. Before he could continue, a knock at the door interrupted them. It was Margaret. Her face was pale, her expression anxious. She had sensed that Henry was close to revealing the truth and had come to stop him. "Henry, "Can I speak to you for a moment?" she asked, her voice tight. Henry nodded reluctantly, stepping outside with Margaret. Ethan watched them go, confusion etched on his face. He could feel the tension but didn't know its source. "Henry," Margaret began, her voice low but urgent, "I know what you're planning to do. Please, don't. It's not just about you, it's about all of us. Telling Ethan now will only hurt him. It will ruin everything." Henry's eyes filled with anguish. "Margaret, I can't keep this inside anymore. He deserves to know the truth. He deserves to know who he is." Margaret's voice broke. "And what about Arthur? What about the life we've built? You'll destroy it all." Henry looked away, his heart heavy. He had spent years convincing himself that silence was the right choice, but now, standing on the brink of death, he couldn't accept it anymore. "I'm sorry, Margaret," he said softly. "I can't leave this world with this lie between us." Margaret wiped away a tear, her hands trembling. She knew there was no stopping him, but the thought of the fallout terrified her. "If you're going to tell him," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "please, let me be there." Henry nodded, understanding the gravity of what was to come. Together, they returned to the house where Ethan was waiting, a mixture of curiosity and concern on his face. "What's going on?" Ethan asked, glancing between Henry and Margaret. Henry took a deep breath, his hands trembling as he gripped the edge of the table. "Ethan, there's something I need to tell you, something I should have told you a long time ago." Margaret sat down, her eyes fixed on the floor, unable to meet Ethan's gaze. The room was silent except for the ticking of the clock, each second stretching into an eternity. Henry's voice cracked as he began. "Ethan, you've always known me as your neighbor, as someone who's been here for you. But the truth is, I'm more than that. I'm your father." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Ethan stared at Henry, his expression frozen in disbelief. "What?" he whispered. Henry's eyes filled with tears. "I'm your father, Ethan. Margaret and I, it was a mistake, something that should never have happened. But you came from it, and I've loved you from the moment you were born." Ethan looked at Margaret, his face pale. "Mom, is this true?" Margaret's hands trembled as she nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry, Ethan," she said, her voice breaking. "I wanted to protect you. I thought it was best if you never knew." Ethan stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. He paced the room, his mind racing. "So, everything I thought I knew about my family, it's all a lie?" Henry reached out, his voice desperate. "Ethan, please, listen to me. None of this changes who you are or the love Arthur has for you. He's been a wonderful father to you, and that will never change." Ethan shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "I need time," he said, his voice trembling. I can't process this right now." Without another word, Ethan walked out of the house, leaving Henry and Margaret in stunned silence. The weight of the truth had finally been lifted, but the cost was immeasurable. Henry sank into his chair, his body trembling. "I've hurt him," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've hurt him in a way I can never undo." Margaret placed a hand on his shoulder, her own tears falling freely. "We both have," she said, "but maybe in time he'll understand." The house was quiet, the echoes of the confession lingering in the air. Outside, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over Willow Creek. And within the walls of Henry's home, the lives of 3 people had been irrevocably changed. Ethan didn't return that night. The air in Willow Creek was heavy with the weight of unspoken words, the quiet streets echoing the storm inside his mind. He wandered aimlessly, his thoughts a whirlwind of emotions. Betrayal, confusion, anger. Every memory he had of his family felt tainted, and the foundation of his identity was shaken. He found himself at the park, the place he used to visit as a child. Sitting on a weathered bench beneath the towering oak trees, Ethan stared into the darkened sky, searching for answers. How could the people he trusted most keep something so monumental from him? And what did this revelation mean for his relationship with Arthur, the man who had raised him, loved him, and taught him everything he knew? Hours later, as dawn began to break, Ethan decided he needed clarity. He couldn't move forward without answers. He returned home, exhausted but resolute. Margaret was waiting for him in the living room, her face pale and drawn. She had been up all night, her mind racing with fear and guilt. "Ethan," she said softly as he entered, "I'm so sorry. I wanted to protect you. I thought—" "Protect me?" Ethan interrupted, his voice trembling. "You didn't protect me. You lied to me. My whole life has been a lie." Margaret flinched at his words, tears brimming in her eyes. "It wasn't a lie," she said. "Arthur loves you. He has always loved you. That's what matters." Ethan shook his head, pacing the room. "And Henry? What about him? Why didn't you ever tell me the truth?" Margaret hesitated, her voice barely a whisper. "Because I was afraid. I didn't want to hurt Arthur. I didn't want to lose the life we built, and I didn't want you to look at me the way you are now." Ethan stopped, his gaze piercing. "You should have told me. I had a right to know." Before Margaret could respond, the sound of the front door opening interrupted them. Arthur walked in, his cheerful demeanor faltering as he sensed the tension in the room. "What's going on?" he asked, looking between Margaret and Ethan. Ethan turned to him, his chest tightening. "Dad," he began, the word feeling foreign on his tongue. "There's something you need to know." Margaret stepped forward, her face pale. "Ethan, no." But Ethan held up a hand, his voice steady. "No more lies. He deserves the truth." Arthur's brow furrowed as he listened, the color draining from his face with every word. When Ethan finished, the room fell into a suffocating silence. Arthur looked at Margaret, his expression a mixture of shock and betrayal. "Is it true?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Margaret nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Arthur, I'm so sorry. It was a mistake. It was one moment of weakness, and I've regretted it every day since." Arthur staggered back, his hands trembling. He looked at Ethan, his voice cracking. "You're my son. That hasn't changed. Nothing will ever change that." Ethan's heart ached at his words, but the pain of the revelation still lingered. "I don't know who I am anymore," he admitted, his voice breaking. "Everything feels broken." Arthur stepped forward, his gaze firm. "You're my son, Ethan. I raised you. I've loved you since the day you were born. That's what matters." Ethan nodded slowly, his emotions a tangled mess. "I need time," he said, his voice trembling. "I need to figure this out." Arthur placed a hand on his shoulder. "Take all the time you need. Just know that I'm here. Always." Later that day, Ethan went to see Henry. The older man was sitting in his living room, his face etched with sorrow and regret. When Ethan walked in, Henry looked up, his eyes filled with unshed tears. "Ethan," he began, his voice trembling. "I'm so sorry. I never wanted to hurt you. I only wanted to be a part of your life, even if it had to be from a distance." Ethan sat down across from him, his emotions raw. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Henry sighed, his hands trembling. "Because I was afraid of what it would do to you, to your family. I thought silence was the best way to protect you. But I see now that I was wrong." Ethan studied him for a long moment before speaking. "I don't know how to feel about all of this, about you." Henry nodded, his expression pained. "I understand. I don't expect forgiveness or acceptance. I just needed you to know the truth before it was too late." The two sat in silence for a while, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. Finally, Ethan stood, his voice quiet but resolute. "I need time to figure this out, but thank you for telling me." Henry nodded, his eyes glistening. "Take all the time you need, Ethan. I'll be here." As Ethan left, he felt a flicker of something he couldn't quite name. It wasn't peace, not yet, but it was a start. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in his life, he felt the possibility of understanding who he truly was. Back at home, Margaret and Arthur sat together in silence, their hands intertwined. The road ahead would be difficult, but they were determined to face it together. And in the quiet of the evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, a fragile sense of hope began to take root. In the days that followed, the Bennett household was steeped in silence, each member navigating their own labyrinth of emotions. Ethan spent most of his time outdoors, walking familiar paths and revisiting places that had shaped his childhood. The once comforting sights of Willow Creek now felt foreign, as though the truth had shifted the ground beneath his feet. Arthur, too, wrestled with the revelation. He had always prided himself on being a devoted father, and while his love for Ethan remained steadfast, the betrayal from Margaret cut deeply. He avoided discussing the matter, choosing instead to bury himself in work, though his heart ached to find a way back to his son and wife. Margaret, weighed down by years of guilt, tried to rebuild the fractured trust between her and Arthur. She moved quietly through the house, cooking meals, tidying rooms, and waiting for a moment when the pain might ease. Yet every glance from Arthur reminded her of the damage that had been done. Henry, confined to his bed most days now, felt the weight of finality settling over him. His confession had lifted the burden he had carried for decades, but it had also left him with an aching uncertainty. Would Ethan ever forgive him? Would he die having shattered the lives of those he cared for most? One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan stood outside Henry's house. He hesitated before knocking, his heart pounding in his chest. When Henry's frail voice called out for him to enter, Ethan stepped inside, the air heavy with unspoken words. Henry lay in bed, his face pale but his eyes bright with recognition. "Ethan," he said, his voice soft. "I wasn't sure if I'd see you again." Ethan sat down beside him, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I needed time," he admitted. "But I realized I couldn't leave things like this." Henry nodded, his gaze steady. "I understand. And I'm sorry, Ethan. For everything. You deserved more than the silence I gave you." Ethan looked at him, his emotions a storm beneath the surface. "I've been angry, I still am, but I've also been thinking about everything you taught me, the time we spent together. I don't know how to reconcile all of this, but I don't hate you." Tears welled in Henry's eyes and his voice cracked as he replied, "That's more than I could have hoped for." The two talked for hours, sharing memories and truths that had long been hidden. For the first time, Ethan allowed himself to see Henry not just as a man who had made mistakes, but as someone who had loved him deeply in his own quiet way. They shared stories of their bond, of the countless afternoons spent woodworking and the life lessons Henry had passed down without ever saying a word. When Ethan left that night, he felt a small weight lift from his shoulders. The path ahead was still unclear, but the beginnings of understanding had taken root. Back at home, Ethan found Arthur sitting in the living room, a photo album open in his lap. He looked up as Ethan entered, his face weary but warm. "I was just looking through these," he said, patting the seat beside him. Ethan sat down, glancing at the photographs of birthdays, vacations, and everyday moments. "Dad," he began, his voice faltering, "I'm sorry for how I've been these past few days. I've been trying to figure out who I am." Arthur placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "You're my son. That's who you are, and nothing will ever change that." Ethan's throat tightened, and he nodded. "I love you," he said quietly. Arthur pulled him into a hug, his voice thick with emotion. "I love you too, Ethan. Always." In the following weeks, the Bennett family began the slow process of healing. Margaret and Arthur attended counseling, facing the pain of their past to rebuild their relationship. Ethan, too, took steps toward understanding his identity, visiting Henry often and finding solace in their shared connection. As winter approached, Henry's health declined further. Ethan was by his side in his final days, holding his hand and listening to his stories. On one particularly quiet December evening, Henry mustered his strength to share a final message with Ethan. "Live your life fully," he whispered. "Don't carry the mistakes of others on your shoulders. You're more than where you came from." When Henry passed away on a snowy December morning, Ethan felt a profound sense of loss but also a deep gratitude for the time they had shared. He realized that forgiveness didn't erase the past, but it allowed for new beginnings. At Henry's funeral, the Bennetts stood together, their grief binding them closer. Ethan delivered a eulogy, his voice steady as he spoke of the man who had taught him so much. "Henry wasn't perfect," he said, "but he loved deeply, even when it was difficult, and for that, I will always be grateful." As the family walked away from the gravesite, snow began to fall, blanketing Willow Creek in a quiet peace. The road ahead was still uncertain, but the wounds that had once divided them were beginning to heal. Together they faced the future with a newfound strength, bound by love, forgiveness, and the courage to move forward.